Everybody, welcome. It's so wonderful to see all these faces. So first, I'd like to thank the Salt Spring Conservancy for hosting this presentation and also recognize their 25-year role in conserving Salt Spring Island's natural spaces. I'm really thrilled to be introducing you to Tania Tripp, my co-enthusiast and colleague in the Screech-Owl world for over 10 years. I'm happy you're joining us for the presentation. With her depth of knowledge of this enigmatic owl, it is perfect that we have her with us today. The webinar marks the official launch of the Conservancy's new 3-year Western Screech-Owl project, which I will be leading. Tania is a biologist with Madrone Environmental Services and has conducted research on the Western Screech-Owl for over 20 years. She did her master's thesis on the bioacoustics of this species, and she continues to study their vocal behaviors. She's worked with many groups on the BC South Coast to initiate Screech-Owl monitoring and habitat restoration and enhancement with nest box programs. The Conservancy's 3-year project is based on a similar one that Tania developed for the Habitat Acquisition Trust in Victoria. For over 10 years now, Tania and I have sought out Salt Spring Screech-Owls and our shared concern for these owls has ultimately led to this project, which is an expansion of the work that the Conservancy's done over the years for this species. I won't forget the first time we were out with her at dusk when we heard a Screech-Owl calling, and Tania located him high in a Douglas fir. Her excitement, respect, and love for this species is palpable. We're blessed to have Tania's support with the Conservancy's project, and we appreciate her giving this presentation today. Without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to you now. Thanks, Tania.
Thank you, Ren. Thank you very much for that beautiful introduction and revisiting those memories, those beautiful memories together for sure. Thank you everybody for joining today and for your interest in the Western Screech-Owl and probably owls in general and conservation and nature. And so hopefully by the end of today, you'll know a few new facts about Western Screech-Owls. I'm going to now share my presentation with everybody. And I think everybody should be able to see that. Okay. So today we're going to talk, as Ren said, about the Western Screech-Owl habitat restoration and monitoring. This is work that I've been involved in for a number of years with a number of groups, and I am very dedicated to working with Conservancy and naturalist groups, and especially as well really enjoy working with education for the junior naturalists. And so a lot of the information from this presentation we'll be able to actually look at results of where the Salt Spring Island Conservancy project may be at in the next year or two as information is collected. So we'll be able to look at examples from the Habitat Acquisition Trust of some of the results that we've achieved there. So with that, just wanted to kind of go over a little bit of an outline of the information we'll be covering today. Just a little bit of background about Western Screech-Owls, what the project goals for the Salt Spring Island Conservancy are, and some of the methods that we hope to use for this work that have been used in other projects. Talk a lot about the nest box program, audio surveys and audio recording units, and the plans for 2021, acknowledgements, and hopefully some breaks. Definitely have some scheduled time for questions. As Deborah mentioned, if you can type your questions in the comment box, when we come to that, I'll try to get to as many as I can today. If there's not an opportunity to answer everybody's questions, then by all means, please email them in. We'll provide email contact for the Conservancy and hopefully be able to follow up with any of your questions that we might not get to today. We'll see. So that's the outline. And I just want to, this photo, for those of you who know or have barns might wonder, that's interesting. That owl looks like it's inside. So this is through the project of the nest box and owl monitoring work with the Fraser Valley Naturalists. Somebody reported that they had a barn owl and that it wasn't a normal barn owl. And sure enough, it was not a normal barn owl. It was a Western Screech-Owl barn owl that nested in the barn in a agricultural field where there were no trees to nest in. So there was obviously plenty of food in a nice, cozy, dry corner of this barn. And so yeah, just a little bit of background behind the photos. And the landowner sent this photo in, so it was clearly, we could not question it. It was pretty exciting to get these kinds of unusual reports. So why the Western Screech-Owl? What's so special about it, other than, sure, it's adorable. It's a beautiful bird, but there's lots of beautiful birds. So what makes Western Screech-Owl so much a focus of my interest? And really the main thing is that I met my first Western Screech-Owl in 1999 in the Cowichan Valley. And I just was instantly in love with them. I love their sounds and the challenge of finding them as far as where they're roosting and where they might be nesting. And I had a grandmother, my Baba, who loved owls, had owls everywhere. So I'm sure she was very influential on my special connection with owls. And with the Western Screech-Owl in 1999, I could find them all over the valley. And I was already being told that they weren't very common at that time, but they didn't seem that hard to find in 1999. And when I started my master's research in 2001, it was still work to find them, but not like it is today. And what I really when I first was introduced to screech owls was when they were really starting to go down in population numbers and really crash on the coast. And through my time in working on this species, unfortunately, it keeps getting increased in its designation as a species at risk. So it's become more and more a species of concern because they are more and more challenging to find because there's not as many around as there used to be. And one of the kind of historical stories that has been shared to many of us from Dave Fraser is when years ago on the University of Victoria campus, I can't remember how many pairs of screech owls there were, but numerous, and the territories were packed in along this one creek every 400 meters where there would be like another territory. And we just don't have that kind of historical numbers at all anymore. So in 2012, it became federally listed as threatened. It is actually blue listed in BC, but recently, I believe that this one slide might be outdated to red listed now to match the federal status. So I should go back and check what that is at the moment. And so basically, well, why? Why were their numbers going down? Well, what's the problem? How come there's so few of them? So the main two kind of core reasons seem to be the expansion of the range of the barred owl. That's B-A-R-R-E-D, so barred owl. The barred owl has caused a lot of problems for the Western Screech-Owl as well as the spotted owl. So it's very closely related to the spotted owl, but it has the fortune of being very flexible in what it can eat and where it can live and where it can nest. And with the screech owls being small and not being familiar with the barred owl as a predator, we believe that a lot of small owls, including Western Screech-Owl, have fallen prey to the barred owl. So it's moved from Eastern Canada, possibly following forest fragmentation is the kind of leading theory. And I think the first records on Vancouver Island are not until mid-60s, I think, is when it first kind of arrived on the coast. So it hasn't been here very long as far as distributions of species go, but it has certainly created some changes in the small owl and owl ecosystems of where which niches, which habitat niches are filled by these various species. So there seems to be some real moving around of where these species occupy. So screech owls used to be most common in riparian zones. That's really where we see all the barred owls now and not many screech owls. And so conservation groups and natural groups have said, what can we do to help the species and how can we help it along with recovery? It's just a distribution map showing basically, we're talking today about Megascops Canacotii. So that is our coastal Western screech owl. I think as early as the 1970s, there was a swarthy eye subspecies on southern Vancouver Island, but that subspecies has been blended with the Canacotii. So there's a number of subspecies across the Western continent. As you go inland is when you get to the McFarlanei subspecies that is also threatened and also red listed. So what are our project goals? So project goals to find, well, where are these screech owls still hanging in there? Are they still around? Where are they, if they are still around at this point? And of course, I haven't said yet, forgot to say, what is the other threat to Western screech owls? Loss of habitat. So loss of habitat is the same threat that many species are facing. You know, a lot of the same areas that they like to live in, we like to live in. And the main loss of habitat for them are places to nest. So because they are a secondary cavity nesting species, they depend on nests being built by woodpeckers. So if the trees aren't old enough for the woodpeckers to use, then they're not going to be creating those potential nests for screech owls. So our first goal was to detect where are they still around. So this would be the same thing for the Salt Spring Island work. Assess the habitat where they are detected and identify appropriate sites for restoration efforts. So it might be, hey, this is a great site and it doesn't even need nest boxes. That's why this owl is still here. So we have a form that we developed of how to assess habitat to kind of support whether or not we need to do the nest boxes at that site or not. Another thing is to protect the habitat if that's possible, or enhance through the nest box program. So survey designs, basically we have a survey protocol. It's a very standardized protocol across all of our surveys of what kind of call we play, which is a male Western screech owl territorial call, if that's what we're doing for trying to find them in areas where we have not surveyed before. Once we know they are there, there's really no point in harassing them and bothering them with the call of an invading male territorial of the same species. So that's where those audio recorder units can come into play, and we'll talk about that later in this presentation. So the time of year that we do our surveys to see if screech owls are around, really it's anywhere from kind of, typically they're really starting to peak with their territorial calling around early February. So from February 1st through mid-April are usually very active vocalizations for territorial males and the females. So they both do the territorial calls. And so attuning your ear to a higher pitch of the female and the lower pitch of the male. And sometimes if you're lucky, you might hear what you think are two males, but if you hear that pitch difference, it could be a duet of a male and a female, both protecting that site and saying this site is occupied. So that's the time of year. We also do these surveys at night. They are nocturnal owls, unlike the northern pygmy owl that is crepuscular. So that means that pygmy owls are most active at dusk and dawn. And so you would do surveys at a different time in the early evening and early morning for northern pygmy owls. But Western screech owls are pretty much from dusk onwards. And so we usually will survey from as soon as it's sunset till around midnight, depending on how many sites we have to visit. If you detect a screech owl right after sunset, it's very likely that you're very close to its core territory, where it's going to plan to be nesting. You detect them later on in the evening, they might be out looking for food, and so it's not as sure thing that they are near a nest at that time. So sometimes we'll focus our methods a little different if we're trying to find out where is the nest site. And what you can do is if you think you know where that might be, you can just sit there at sunset, at dusk, and just wait for them to start calling. And if they call really quite soon, then you might hear both of them call and just sit and absorb the beauty of being serenaded by these gorgeous, beautiful little owls. Spacing of survey stations. So we try to do a survey station every 800 meters, and part of that is to if you already detected it before, you're trying to give it some space and move on to where the next territory might be. Through work that Ren and I have done over the last 5 years, we have found two pairs, two core territories on Salt Spring and in Maple Bay that were within 900 meters of one another. So that really supports our comfort of if you do 800-meter spacing. However, there are other recommendations for survey protocol to do the surveys every 400 meters. If you have a detection, you would not want to do that kind of tight spacing right after you detected one, in my opinion. However, some do use that method. Time spent at each station. So I think in my thesis, I looked into, well, what's the average response time after you're finished your call? And it's usually they'll answer within 10 minutes. So I feel it's very important to spend at least 10 minutes. It'll feel like forever sometimes if it's cold and it's really quiet. And if you have children with you who really don't want to just sit there for 10 minutes being cold. So, but you do need to be patient. I ask that 10 minutes is really the minimum that you would want to do to feel like you really were listening. 15 minutes is even better. And the call broadcast, like I mentioned, that we play at each site. So when we do detect screech owls, we like to go and find out, well, whose land is this screech owl on? So that's where land owner with the contacting of figuring out whose property that screech owl might be on and see if we can get permission to look for potential nest sites and to maybe do a transect through the area of walking around and gathering habitat information about what kind of forest age, what kind of tree species, what is the canopy complexity. So what that means is it like a young forest where the canopy is all one layer, or are there multiple layers where there might be some of those old veteran trees that are still present? Looking for wildlife trees and woodpecker signs. So are woodpeckers, do we hear them? Do we see their activity? Because that's great because they're restoring the habitat for themselves, creating it for themselves for their own purposes, but also benefiting many other species by creating those opportunities for secondary cavity nesters. This is a very special slide. It's hard to see. That yellow arrow is pointing at an actual natural nest site. This is a nest tree that Ren and I searched high and low. Really, it took us probably 8 years of just narrowing down where this bird was calling from and spending many evenings just trying to get closer and closer to where we think it might nest. And then I think, and Ren, maybe you can jump in here in a minute, but I feel like we spent 2 different afternoons with some other friends just looking for any nesting cavity opportunities at that site. And this was the one and only that we kept going, well, that really is the only really good one. But at the time we didn't have a tall enough pole with a camera on it to actually check.
Yeah, that's right, Tanya. We looked and we looked, but your spidey senses were right on for that nest cavity, because when we were able to get back there with a camera, we did find that, in fact, that was the spot. Yeah,
there was some pretty excited jumping and happy dances that day. So this nest was used in 2015 and in 2017 to successfully fledge chicks, which was great. We were very excited about that. In 2016, there were no detections at this site. And then they were back again in 2018. But they didn't nest in 2018. We never recorded or detected any chicks or them ever incubating eggs in the nest. Don't know why, but that was a common thing for a few of the sites that I helped monitor that year. So it just could have been, I think Ren and I also noticed that the prey density, there didn't seem to be as much to eat that year. That's probably the most likely #1 reason of why they wouldn't have had successful nesting attempts that year, is just they didn't have the food to sustain that activity. And unfortunately, those really strong winter storms of, I think that winter following that season, Ren, this tree came down.
That's correct. Yeah, it was in a big storm of 2018.
Yeah, so that's just heart-wrenching. We knew it wasn't long, it wouldn't be standing for long, because we even, you could feel your mind was saying, you really shouldn't go too close to this tree. It didn't look like it was very stable. So those winds knocked it down, and unfortunately, so we put recordings up hoping that the birds were still in the area, and they just aren't. And so that truly was the nesting opportunity for them. Anything else to add to that one, Ren?
No, just that, yeah, that's clearly the serious limiting factor for these owls. So nest box program for this area for sure.
And these adorable little fluff balls, this is a photo from Ren from this nest site from 2000, do you know, was this the fledging of 2015 or 17?
I think 17.
Yeah. And so these, at this stage, they were not long fledged from that nest. They would have, and I can't imagine how they got out of that tree. Like if we go backwards, like, what did they do? Did they kind of just go for it and try to jump to a branch? Did they plunk down onto this branch? That would have been quite the first exposure to the world. And then what they tend to do is, because as you can see, the other thing that's really missing from this site is any protective security habitat. There's no understory vegetation. There's no shrubs. There's no ocean spray. There's just nothing. There's no salal. There's really not much for a freshly fledged chick to go hide in. And so what they tend to do at these sites is they climb up a nearby tree and they get up into the canopy like these little ones are doing. They're very, very vulnerable at this stage, and the adults are very protective of them. There's another photo that Ren got of a roosting male. And it's kind of hard to explain how hard it is to get these photos, right, Ren? I mean, how many photos do you think you've gone through for?
I think I've gotten 3 or 4 good photos in over 10 years.
Yeah, it's a lot of work. And as well, in all that time, we've just had that one natural nest tree on Salt Spring Island. I think it's the only nest confirmed on Salt Spring Island in the last 20 years. People have had detections, but not an actual nest record of an occupied nest, I believe. So that's definitely a goal of mine, is to continue to find and confirm active natural nests whenever possible. So moving into our nest box program, this is just a photo. Basically, if you went through those trees, I'm looking east at Salt Spring Island. This is whenever I'm up in Maple Bay monitoring the nest boxes there. I'm always waving to Ren. Hey Ren owls on Salt Spring. And this box, we worked with the Girl Guides in the Cowichan Valley in 2004. We put up, I think, 40 nest boxes as one of their projects that they chose to participate in. And we had one used, I think they were in 2004. We confirmed in 2006. My sister and I didn't get to monitor it every year. But again, it was used in 2011. And then in 2014, that original round of boxes, many of them started to fall out of the trees. So the lifespan of these nest boxes, if they're not installed properly, seems to be around 10 years. But the more recent nest box efforts, I'm hoping for more like 15 to 20 years. You can't help it though if a windstorm comes and knocks a tree, and literally at this site in 2016, we installed 6 new boxes, and that winter a tree just happened to fall and smash the box off of an adjacent tree. So it's why we also really like to have multiple boxes at each site to give these birds an opportunity to kind of pick and choose of what it is they're looking for and a nest box location. I don't know if you can see, but there's a little owl. There's this Western Screech-Owl sticking its head out of this box. And these were the boxes put up with the Girl Guides in 2004. I believe this photo was 2011. And this site is that very first site that I found my first screech owl with Derek Marvin in 1999. He took me to hear this species. And this is the site that to this day is still active. It's moved around a little bit here and there by like a couple hundred meters, but really pretty phenomenal and wonderful that this site has been active for so long. I'm sure there's been turnover and they're not the same owls, but still. So some of the aspects of these programs that I know that Salt Spring Island Conservancy is going to do as well is to have an information kind of page introducing folks to some basic information about Western screech owls and what they can listen for and when to listen, and some maybe websites with further details for those of you who want to go take your time to learn more about them. So there's quite an outreach aspect of these types of projects that the folks that are involved, such as myself and Ren and Deborah and Penny and all of us, you know, we like to meet people. We like to learn about, you know, what you're interested in too on your property and the species of interest in your backyards. So these involve site visits, phone calls, brochures, nest box program, and annual reports that get posted so you can read what were the results of everybody's efforts annually. Nest boxes. So for HAT, we've involved the Scouts have helped with building boxes. Lots of groups have helped. Kids really love, this is just a real hands-on project that I highly encourage where it's COVID friendly, you know, and that can keep a kid who's maybe a parent wants to unplug them from being plugged in too much, and it's a hands-on project that is just really a good fun thing to do, especially if you can report back to the kids that a box was used. I think that's a really wonderful sense of achievement for these future naturalists. So, and then the bottom right corner is my little one many years ago with Papa building nest boxes in the garage. This is just to show people kind of some, because I'm often asked, how high up do these nest boxes have to be? So I always say as high as you feel safe installing them. So safety first, always have somebody at the foot of the ladder, and always only go as high as you're comfortable going. We usually put them about 3 meters up, but they can be lower. It doesn't have to be 3 meters. So just go with what feels safe. And I think you can see my arrow here, but this is one site, and this is kind of the spacing of 2 boxes. And we just kind of had them, you know, one every 20 meters along this kind of transect area that we thought they would be interested in using them. And this was a site that was successfully used by screech owls. In fact, 2 different property owners, they have a friendly rivalry of which property the screech owl is going to use that year. These are just some other examples of just once the nest boxes are installed on trees. The one on the left is just a really creative way that a landowner on Thetis Island felt like they just would prefer to use a bungee cord so that if the owl didn't like it, they could move it. They could adjust it higher or lower and not necessarily put screws into the tree in this case. So there's ways, if that's something that somebody's not comfortable with, there's different designs that can be used, such as this. I haven't heard back on the success of if that box is still there or how long that bungee cord would last, but I haven't heard that that maybe Anne can email me and give me an update on the bungee cord boxes from Thetis Island. Oh, the other thing is it's very, very important to label for Salt Spring Island Conservancy, to have a label, the year the box is installed and the number of the box that was installed that year. You can kind of see this says hat box 3, and it was, I think, 2015. So the key is that box number and the year it was installed, so we can track the success of our nest box efforts. And a GPS or UTM location of where they're installed. Those are kind of the key pieces of information. So a big part of what we do are monitoring the nest boxes, right? We want to know, well, does this do any good? Is there any point in continuing with nest box efforts? And I'd say, just like any kind of research, the more we kind of monitor, we learn, you know, what we can do differently. We learn maybe what the owl might prefer. We're still working on that one. And we learned that the boxes are used by other species. So on Thetis Island, I believe not last year, but the year before, I think 3 boxes were used by northern saw-whet owls. And they had all these little baby saw-whets in there. And so, you know, I see that as a success. If a cavity nesting owl uses this, that is great, because they obviously needed that opportunity and we provided it for them. And saw-whets aren't out competing or competing with screech owls as far as I'm aware. So if it's used by a different species of small owl, that's fantastic. So yeah, hopefully we'll find a screech owl in one of the Thetis Island boxes this year, maybe. So monitoring them from year to year, the main reason we're monitoring them is to confirm if they were used. So you can start monitoring them as early as March, but really to minimize disturbance, the best is to check them in early May, because by then the female would be incubating eggs and she's very unlikely to, there's very limited risk of flushing her from that site and her not returning to it. So she'll sit tight to those eggs. That's a big investment for her and her partner there to stay with those eggs. Maintenance in the fall or winter, obviously you wouldn't want to go check and clean these when the owls could still be around. So we recommend that take place in the fall and the winter. Through our efforts of monitoring, I think we've kind of settled on, you probably don't need to check to clean these boxes more than once every 3 years, but it depends on how much squirrel activity you have in your area. And by squirrel activity, Salt Spring and Thetis are super lucky to just have the red squirrels, because the gray squirrels pack these boxes up to the roof. So that can be, you know, we wonder, will that prevent an owl from being able to use that box? Our feeling is it will make it easier if you remove all those branches. So yeah, and then on the left is one of my co-op students from a number of years ago, Octavio, and he's just got this pole, which is a painter pole with a camera mounted on top to check what's going on inside that box. And then my little field assistant in the bottom right corner is my daughter, Sierra. And these are pictures from inside boxes. So the upper left one is, I'd say, more typical of what a red squirrel might do, of kind of lichen and moss. I have no concern if there's a little lichen and moss added to a box. I feel it will still be used by an owl. That's not a problem. I'm sure they do that in natural cavities. That's fine. The box on the right, though, is gray squirrel activity of really packing in those branches. And I'll show you, there is a picture in a little bit that shows where an owl did actually pack this down and nest on top of it, but it certainly didn't give them a lot of room to move. And then the other pictures are, okay, bottom left corner, some sort of bird was in this box, but not sure what. We think some of those may have been woodpecker feathers. I have seen a lot of boxes used just checked out by northern flickers. So that's pretty fun. Not, oh, and one that had nesting, that's right. So Joanna Preston is my kind of Victoria equivalent of Wren, of the person, a very close friend that we go and check owls very often together. And actually, Joanna and I confirmed a northern flicker nesting in one of our boxes last year. I think there were 5 eggs. So yeah, you just, again, is that a bad thing? No, I still think, what kind of flicker would want to use a nest box? Maybe a really smart one. And then the bottom right corner is just no activity. The shavings that we put in there look dry, look open for business, but not used. And just another photo. This one is from one of the first nest box programs I was involved in Campbell River, that was funded through the Fish and Wildlife Compensation Program. I think we started with 200 boxes over 2 years that were installed. And this was really our first time of doing a big nest box effort on Vancouver Island. The unfortunate thing is, because of the remoteness of these boxes, and that we only put kind of 2 here and there off of remote Forest Service road areas, we just didn't do any monitoring. So we don't really know, just unless this just happened to be active when I went back to do some recordings for my graduate studies, that we were able to check some boxes and find this one occupied. And the next photo is inside the female with at least 2 chicks in front of her. And she's probably got another one hiding under her. So very wonderful when you find the boxes getting used, most definitely. So I'm going to share some videos now with everybody. 2 videos. The first one is the first natural nest cavity that I ever found, which was in Maple Bay, and really look at the size of the tree it used for nesting. It's very, very small. And it was that year that we put up the new boxes, because in 2014, they were basically all on the ground. So this was, I think, 2015, my sister and I, we were looking for nest cavity. And I said, let's put it in there. And we just couldn't believe what we found. So I will show you that. Okay, so this is basically a camera at a top of kind of a rigged system, my very first camera setup. And there she is. And you can even see, because you know, for those of you who know the size of Western Screech-Owl, they're a pretty small owl. This is a pretty small nest tree. I think it was around 21 centimeters diameter at breast height, like a very, very small. And that tree also fell down in the winter storms of 2018. But by then we had already had other nest boxes up. And literally the year those nest boxes were up, they abandoned this tree and went straight over 200 meters to the nest, to the boxes, which are on protected areas in the North Cowichan forestry lands. This natural nest site that fell over is on private land. And although we had permission to go on it, there's possible development planned in the future. So the sooner we could kind of convince the owls to move to a protected area. So that's another good use of nest box programs for sure. And then at that same tree, this is a video of a prey delivery. So this is just a little basic trail camera. I think I paid $150 for it at Canadian Tire. It's not good resolution, I will warn you. But it was successful at capturing a number of prey deliveries. So you just have to wait for it's going to fly right up to the hole at the top of that tree on the left. And there it goes, bringing food into the nest. And you can imagine there's probably not a lot of room to maneuver. And then poking its eyes out, looking for, before it decides to fly away, that it looks safe to fly back out. Nest box maintenance. So this is a site in Victoria. When we installed it, you can see the nice little shavings on the bottom. And then a squirrel came in and said, "Oh, thank you for this lovely box." And then a screech owl nested right here. And then when the screech owl fledged, the squirrel came back in and kept filling up the box. So this was the kind of box that made a lot of sense to clean out in the fall for sure. And then this is just when we cleaned the box, we found an unhatched egg. So perhaps if it wasn't so full and there was more space, maybe they would have been more successful. I don't know. I know that this site had at least one chick fledged, possibly two. And so they're quite a small little egg. And so on the South Coast, through working with so many wonderful groups, we've installed over 450 nest boxes since 2015, which is phenomenal. Just really incredible to see these kinds of effort. I wouldn't be surprised if that was over 600 now, but unfortunately not everybody has entered their data into our database for nest box efforts. But this is just through talking to the other project leads, where I think it's between 450 and 600 now. Yeah, and so something that I'm hoping that Salt Spring Island Conservancy will also add their data to this database, so we can track where the boxes are going, how often they're being checked, and whether, most importantly, are they successful or not. So I'm going to pause. I've been doing a lot of talking, and we'll see, are there any questions people would like to enter into the comments section? And Deborah, I don't know if you can see any yet. I'm just having to kind of re-expand my
Yes,
Zoom.
I can. There are quite a few questions already in there from throughout the presentation.
In the chat.
In the chat box. Jacqueline Shirk would like to know what species of woodpeckers you are referring to.
Oh, excellent question. Those lovely northern flickers and pileated woodpeckers. So our two kind of big woodpeckers are definitely making the size of a nest cavity ideal for a screech owl.
And what is that size?
Well, when we make the nest boxes, we make a 3-inch diameter opening. So I'm sure it could be from like 2¼ or 2½ inch to 3 inch, but you don't want it bigger than a 3-inch opening, or that's when a barred owl could get into that hole. And we wouldn't want to be creating nest boxes that allowed barred owls to go like, "Oh, a tasty snack for me," and go grab them out of a nest box. They can't help themselves. They really will eat just about everything. I've seen barred owls even eating worms and all kinds of things. They're very clever.
Pierre would like to know, do they avoid edges or human habitation except for the barn-loving owl?
So there isn't any research on edge effects for Western screech owls, but that said, just like with many other forest dwelling species, when you all of a sudden kind of don't have a contiguous enough area of coverage, I'm sure that edge's effect can kick in to have them eventually be too exposed to predation and it not be a safe place to nest, and then they might choose to go somewhere else. So there is certainly an avenue and an opening for research on that subject for sure. And I haven't seen them, like, they're quite often behind people's houses within, you know, a couple hundred meters, some of the ones in Victoria for sure. So I wouldn't say they avoid people. So I think, again, it just depends on how kind of intact your forest is around your house, of how secure and what the understory kind of coverage is for security for fledged chicks. Like, kind of like how natural is that setting for sure would be beneficial.
Gail would like to know what the favorite food of the screech owl is.
Oh boy. Okay, so Western screech owls, they have a wide variety in their diet. One of the species that they eat that I find really fascinating are the Western sideband. You know, our largest native snail. Is everybody familiar with the sideband? They're a very beautiful snail. And if you look for where you find their shells, look and see if you can find a shell that is no longer have a snail in it, that has a little hole in it. So they have a way of eating those snails, and beetles and all kinds. They'll eat insects, moths, small mammals, and small birds. So those are kind of their kind of main things that they will eat. So they are a predator. So they will eat small mammals. Probably their main thing would be, you know, the mice, shrews, voles. There's not really as many voles around where they're living, but small birds. What about, Ren, do you remember, wasn't there one year we had a whole huge migration of, is it fairy thrush? I'm trying to remember that. Just looking to Ren here.
Yes, it was varied thrush, and I think we found kill sites for varied thrush on Salt Spring as well as in the Victoria area.
Yeah, and then
there could be another year for that because we have a lot of thrush species around right now with the big arbutus berry crop this year.
I would think that'd be the largest bird that they would possibly take out. So robins, I think the more common is more of a junco size type bird, more of those common bird species.
Yeah.
Thank you for that question.
Chris Drake asks, we're told to put up nest boxes in pairs. Do you see another close nest tree on Salt Spring?
So if the question, can I ask for a little bit of clarification, is, so I guess I really think that nest boxes should be impaired, but be impaired. No impaired nest boxes in pairs. I personally prefer the more the merrier. If you go into an old forest site, you're not going to see one nest cavity. You're going to see probably hundreds if you look closely at all the big trees. In a natural forested area, an owl would have many opportunities to pick and choose what nest cavity was best for them and met their needs. And so in our second growth forests, the nest boxes I really see as kind of, you know, a temporary approach for as the woodpeckers are doing their work, to let the woodpeckers catch up on building those sites for them, and in the meantime provide nest boxes. So the more boxes that you could put up, so quite often I'm asking people to put at least 6 in a cluster, because of those very reasons. Also, like I mentioned, where a tree, the wind just happened to knock another tree down that hit a box out of the tree, or how that box settled onto the tree, it split open, or how a box was installed. We didn't know that the predominant winds would blow all the rainwater into it and then make a frozen puddle of mushy shavings, right? So it's good to have options for the owls. I also believe that more boxes would reduce the likelihood of predation, because predators have to check more boxes that way. It's a pretty obvious thing when a box is introduced to a new area. But that said, I don't know of any predation cases yet. I have captured a black bear on video climbing a tree and sticking his nose into the Maple Bay nest box. I am now far more careful when I go there on my own. Yeah, and also if you think of a territory being kind of a core of about, if you put the nest that they're selecting and you kind of go 300 meters out from that, really you could have multiple properties all putting 6 to 10 boxes on their site to increase chances of maybe they'll come to this area, or clusters around where they are and then where they might disperse to, so that you could create a new territory next to an existing one. That's another approach that we're testing in Victoria. I hope that answered the question.
Sorry, Tania, I got pulled away for a moment in that, but I think the question was also specifically asking if there was another nest next to the one on Salt Spring that you had found.
We haven't found it. We've detected the pair, but we haven't found it. But what's interesting is the adjacent site that's about 900 meters from that site doesn't need nest boxes. And so it's really annoying to try to find the nest, right, Ren? Because there's a lot of veteran tall fir snags at that site that we don't have cameras tall enough to reach, number one. And there's many, many cavities that we find in many different trees. So we just can't check them all, but we know that that is a nest site.
Thank you. Tania, I should let you know that we took 10 minutes worth of questions there, and I still have 11 messages in the chat box. So I'll leave it up to you how we proceed here.
Okay, let's take 2 more.
Okay.
Any other about nest boxes?
I'll look for nest boxes specific here. Oh, it looks like the bungee cord broke, sadly, on that box you were talking about earlier.
That's good to know, though.
David would like to know, do the owls show preference for the compass orientation of the boxes, southwest, north side of a tree, etc.?
Not that we can tell yet. So that's part of what we collect for every box that I install, and I try to encourage anybody who does install them. There was a paper that I read about 5 years ago that was, somebody tried to answer that question about a species of owl, and they found that everybody was really good at saying how many boxes they installed, but not collecting data about what was it made from, what were the dimensions of the box, what was it, direction was it facing, how high up was it. And so then it like looked at all nest box programs across, I think, the world or something. It was just amazing at how little of that kind of basic data was collected. And so we try to do that at we have a form for installations of just to document how high up is it, was there anything unique about the design, what direction was it facing. So excellent question, and I don't have an answer. I've seen them in an opening facing downslope, facing upslope. I'd say definitely avoiding the dominant wind directions, probably a good idea. Ren and I were talking about that, because if the predominant wind blows rain into the opening, then it's not staying dry, which it's kind of, you don't really know until you install the boxes and then say, maybe I should put this box on the other side of the tree. Ren, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just we've just put our first boxes up, and it's interesting to note that some of them are wet and other ones aren't. So this will all become clear or clearer as we move along.
All right, so our final question in this portion. Do you know if barred owls are around? Sorry, if you know barred owls are around, is it best not to put up a nest box?
I would not put up a nest box where you know there's a barred nest, or you know that there's a pair vocalizing on a regular basis and that you're likely in a barred owl territory. If you know there's barred owls cover really huge areas, it's pretty surprising. So, or not surprising in their case. So just because you mean that it's not pseudo slope from those kinds of sites where Ren and I are finding the strongholds, kind of the drier upper slopes seem to be not as favored by bards for hunting. So, but I do have many recordings with barred owls and screech owls kind of, but they're not like right on top of each other. You can kind of hear the screech owl call its territory, and then you can hear the great horned, the bards, the pygmy earlier in the evening. So I think if a site has a lot of nesting opportunities and a lot of food, you can have them all living together. But I certainly wouldn't advise nest boxes where you know there is an active pair, or down in those riparian zones where the barred owls are more likely to visit. Ren, do you have a feeling about that one way or the other?
Well, it's interesting because the one screech owl site that I located this year, I wasn't hearing barred owls at all throughout the winter for that pair. But then once we had chicks, all of a sudden, boom, there were the barred owls. This is a really tricky question. And I would agree with you that if you know you've got a pair of barred owls that's in your area and you're hearing them fairly often, I wouldn't put nest boxes up. That would, I agree with that.
Yeah, but on the other hand, where we have most of our successful remaining sites that we know about, there's a great horned very close by, a great horned nest pair. So it seems to be at the moment, because the great horns have so much to eat, that they're not bothered with the screech owls, and they may be providing some sort of protection for the screech owls by nesting closer to, like within a comfort zone of being near the great horned pair, that if a barred owl comes in that distance, the barred owl might regret that decision. And we have observed barred owls that were killed by great horned owls from being in their territory. So that has been documented in the Cowichan Valley for sure. I think in Victoria by Anne Nightingale too. If you got to pick a large owl to put your nest boxes by, great horns. They seem to be friends to the screech owls. So yeah, I can't think of one site that doesn't have great horns near it.
I have one site
With no great horns, yeah.
with no great horns.
So there's been far more great horned owls in the last kind of 15 years. They seem to be really picking up in their numbers. And so maybe I have high hopes that there's more of an ecological balance that we're going through at the moment, with that whole predator dynamics of the owls on the island and on the coast, between great horns and bards and screech owls and saw-whets and pygmies. And I like to have those positive visualizations. Okay, so moving on, we will continue with moving into our audio recording work section of our presentation. So in our first 2 years with HAT, we didn't use the audio recorders, and then we introduced them in 2017 because my sister and I and Ren were playing around with recorders, and like, oh my gosh, we really need to be doing more of this. This is pretty fascinating what you can learn from it. So all kinds of different recording units. This happens to be the set that I have from Cornell University. They're called Swift units. However, if you have the money, the wildlife acoustics units are definitely the top-notch recording units to be using, which is very fortunate. I believe funding has enabled Salt Spring Island Conservancy to purchase, I think you have 2 or 3 now, Ren?
We have 3 now, and I have one personally, so that can be used as well.
Yeah, so that's wonderful. Those recording units are really the top ones, but when you buy them yourself, you know, I deal with the problems that I get for $250 compared to $1,000. So this one here just shows, I put the microphone sticking up the tree. I find I get more likely because they're calling from the top of the canopy. Most of these recorders are designed for songbirds and have the microphones going to the sides, but I just use one microphone pointed up. This is my sister, Roxanne Tripp, and she was she was able to borrow these SM2 wildlife acoustic recorders in that 2015, because we said, oh, we really got to play around with this stuff. So she was able to get these, and then we were hooked. It's truly addictive as a hobby, these audio recording units. So one of the things is site selection, when to deploy the recordings, collecting recordings, scanning recordings. The recordings can really help you know where you might want to spend time looking for nests, help with habitat information, and for submitting nest records if you're successful in finding them. So the benefits of acoustic monitoring, I'm just a huge fan of this, and I really, really love that it's non-invasive. When you put these recordings up, you're not harassing them, you're not eliciting and forcing them to do a call to defend their territory. And I am shocked, like absolutely shocked at the diversity of calls and bioacoustics. I did my master's in bioacoustics, and then through doing this, I hear calls that I never heard through doing my master's research, because when I was doing that research, I was always calling them with a territorial call. And so of course, what did I usually hear? A territorial call and response. I didn't hear all their other communications, all their different sounds, all the natural ways that they interact with one another. And so I still think that call broadcast methods are really important for areas where you're kind of going out and say, are there any screech owls? Let's go find if they're even in this area. But once you know that a site is occupied, that's where it's really good to use recording units year to year to say, yes, it's occupied again. There's really, in 1 week of a recorder being up at a site, you're going to know if that screech owl is at that site again, yes or no. And then you might even hear that there's a female as well. So that's even better. And then you can leave them up where you have a pair, and then you can use it to detect if they successfully fledged chicks. So if you hear the chicks making their unique sounds, then you can say it was a successful site. The majority of that you're just not going to ever obtain through a call broadcast method. That's a very specific method for a specific purpose. So there's always a little bit of a risk too when you're doing a call broadcast of a screech owl, that you might attract a barred owl in response. And they will come in very silently. You won't even know they're there. And then all of a sudden you see them or you hear them, and they rarely even vocalize. They'll just fly in very stealthy like. And so you need to be careful about the use of that, which is also why we recommend, if you do have a barred owl respond to playing a Western Screech-Owl call, you stop your calls. Doesn't mean you can never do that survey there again, but for that night, in that case, you should not continue on with that survey at that site. I think I even recommend, I can't remember, Ren, but even like skip over even the next site. Just kind of.
For 800-meter ones, you do, yeah.
Yeah, just really, we don't need to put them at any further disadvantage than they already are. So you can leave these out. You can have them record for 2 hours, for 4 hours, for 6 hours, however long, all day long. So you can have an incredible amount of data of how often are they calling, what kind of calls are they using, what other birds are in the area. It helps to reduce how much area you have to search for the nest, because like I said, if they're calling at that kind of dawn dusk period, you're probably right near the nest. Really helping to expand our vocal repertoire of screech owls. It's on the wish list that Ren and Joanna and I have to put together like an example of visually spectrograms, how you can see the call and hear the call and what context they were used. That's one of our side future projects. Maybe a paper, Ren. Breeding behavior, so the courtship period, quantificate how often are their prey deliveries. You can get so much information from these recordings. The main one that we're using for it right now is the site active? Is there a pair? And was it a successful pairs? And did we detect chicks? And anybody that has questions about this part of the presentation, please add your comments in there, and hopefully we'll go through some more questions in a little bit. So the limitations. Oh, these recorders sound amazing, Tania. Where can I get one? Well, let me first warn you of the downside. So like I said, highly addictive. Cost, it's not cheap. Not many of them even have a system that you can use rechargeable batteries, which is really unfortunate. But they're getting much better at that. Storing the data. I have this massive, I think it's like 8 terabyte data external hard drive that I've been storing 3 years of recordings on. I'm gonna probably have to get another external drive soon. I mean, the sound recordings take up a lot of space, a lot of file space. So if you're somebody who holds on to things, it's really hard because I'm like, well, what if I need that file at some point in the future? So I'm a bit of a file recording hoarder. But if you're good at going, I listened to it, there's no screech owls, I'm deleting it. Well, then that's great. Maybe you can give me a lesson in that. So storing the data and reviewing thousands of hours of recording. So we still haven't quite mastered how to do an automated search through the recordings to find the screech owls, but there's a bunch of us working on that and we are getting better at it. But personally, I still feel most confidence to just visually check them myself. And I think that's what Ren does too. You just kind of get really quick at scanning them. We're going to show you some files in a minute so you can see them. My daughter Sierra, she calls them moms looking for grubs because it's a series of little circles. It looks like a little, that's what she calls it. So we'll see. You can see the picture in a minute and see what you think of her reference there. So some example results from work with HAT in 2018, we had 15 sites that we recorded over a 3-month period. We got like 2,000 hours of recordings and we found 2 occupied and that 1 was a pair and 1 was a single male. So you can get a lot of good information from these recordings. And I don't think we would have, one of those sites we did not detect with call broadcast. Other thing is you learn about the other owls that are there. So at site 4, we had a screech owl, but we also had a pair of great horned owls. At site 8, we had a pair of screech owls and a pair of barred owls, and we detected northern pygmy owl. And then many of the other sites, every site had an owl species of some kind. And if we hadn't done those recordings, we wouldn't know that. So we're gathering a lot of information about that kind of dispersal and dynamics of who occupies what, where, and how. So, but have really only used the data so far to just look at these main questions for screech owls. So getting into sounds, the soundscape of Western screech owls. They have all kinds of sounds. The most common one that we're all familiar with is the territorial call. We're most familiar with it because it's kind of the most classic call that you would hear if you're, walking along your neighborhood at night. That's the kind of most likely one that you would hear. It's kind of the one that they give the most loud broadcast with, but it's also the most common one we have in response to playing that call to them. They also have a secondary call that's called, often referred to as the trill or the double trill. We have found that all the owls we've recorded have a thing called a drum call. So we've heard this in pygmy owls and saw-whet owls and screech owls. I don't think I've really heard it so much in the large owls, but the small owls will like take that single note and just go with it. And it's definitely associated with courtship, where they just like go on and on and on and on, and not very loud. It's like, I think my professor would probably say it's demonstrating how, like its viability, like I'm a good mate. Look at the energy. I have so much energy and I'm so healthy and I'm so ready to have this nest with you. And look at, I can just sit here and just sing, 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 because I have all this energy and I'm very healthy and I'm a good mate. So it's kind of like communicating a lot of that acoustic information to the female, but the female will do this drum call as well. So that's really interesting because you do not see really a lot of description about this particular vocalization that Ren's going to play an example in a little bit for everybody. Juvenile calls and barks and bill clapping or clacking and clapping and rattle calls, all kinds of calls that they make. I lied, I have one more thing before we play you a screech owl. So through that ARU research, remember I mentioned that site with Hat that had a pair. So there was a breeding pair at one station. I think it was station 8 and a single male at the other station. Blue is the single male. Wherever you see blue in here on the y-axis, this is the number of territorial calls that owl did on a given night. So if you look at March 31st, the single male did over 900 territorial calls. He was just doing his best to say, anybody out there? Anybody? Anybody? I'm here. I'm healthy. I'm ready. I've got these great nest boxes. Come on, come on. Versus the paired male didn't have a lot of output at all, other than kind of, you know, in the early part of the evening, a few calls, and then his focus is finding food for the female. So I found this just very fascinating, that contrast and the amount of energy that single male is putting out there to get a pair. And the next year he found a female. That was last year. Unfortunately, it was a failed nest. Now, it could have been that female's just young and it was her first attempt at nesting. So I'm really hoping that they stay paired and return and are successful this year. Okay, so before we go to questions, I'm going to switch over to Kaleidoscope here. I'm going to start, Ren, with the duet. And so what Ren is going to play for you in a minute, and I'll mute myself, is this recording. It's this exact recording that we're looking at, but unfortunately, playing it on my computer, you won't be able to hear it. So we've tried a whole bunch of things, and Ren has a really good system with a speaker, so you shouldn't have to adjust your volume at all to hear this. And so you'll hear a male. This is a male cluster, and then this is a male with a female. See how she's higher frequency above the male, and then a male and a male female and a male. And so she will now play this beautiful call for you.
And I just also, to set this up a little later in this call sequence, the female starts to do that drum call that Tania was talking about. You can see that those single notes all in a row, and then the male also starts to sing there as well. So I will play this. Whoa, wait a minute. Excuse me. My speaker decided not to play. We will try that again. What is happening?
I was able to hear it, Ren, on with my earbuds in.
Yeah, we could hear it, Ren.
I could hear it. She's frozen.
Can you start it from the beginning, Ren? Can you start it from the beginning?
Yes. Sorry, folks. Rowan, make sure you're muted. Speak. Sorry for this, you guys. I will try it again. Okay, that's that one.
Thank you, Ren. And then what's the next one that you want to play? The prey delivery?
The prey delivery. Just let me set up my speaker at the right level because this
So I'll
one's
just
a lot louder.
explain to people what we're looking at. So this is from a nest box, a recorder that I had aiming right at a nest box that I knew was active. And this kind of single note is the juvenile. It's called I refer to it as the rattle call. Kind of has a little rattle sound to it. And in here is a bunch of fluttering of its wings when the food's first brought to the nest box. And then you can hear the male doing this double trill, this secondary call that I mentioned before.
Okay.
Thank
Hope
you, Ren.
everybody was able to hear that.
That one came across really clearly. So yeah, this is just one of the kind of software programs that we use to review the recordings. Pretty much there's a number of them out there. There's one that's free from Cornell. There's one that's free from Wildlife Acoustics for viewing purposes. In both cases, I think Cornell's is Raven Pro. And then Wildlife Acoustics is Kaleidoscope Pro. And then there's other programs like, I think, Ren, Audacity. Is that one that you've used to review recordings?
Yeah, Audacity you can set up as a sonogram, so you can look at recordings, but obviously they don't analyze. It's for running through manually on that.
Okay, questions. Do we have more questions?
We do. I'll just scroll through here. Would there be a value in broadcasting a female's call or chick sounds?
Yes, if you're trying to capture the owls, that's a method that has been used in the interior to basically elicit such a strong response that they'll actually like come in and get caught in a net to then band them or do telemetry studies. So those other recordings have been used with success to help capture screech owls. Nobody's really fully tested the efficacy of if you were doing your call broadcast with a female territorial versus a male. And I think you could definitely do that. I've just kind of stuck with always playing the male because I'm consistent with the standards, but there's a lot of people who have been, not a lot, there's a few people who have done a male call and they wait the 10 minutes and they do a female call. So it just means you're longer at each station, or they might work with that. But I don't think anybody has ever used the juvenile ones. And I don't know how I would feel about risks or what and when you would use that. I think that would be something that would need further thought.
John and Sarah would like to know, do they call like this in the winter? If so, they think they have one in their backyard.
Hey! Yes, they're calling right now. They are. I have left recorders up, and pretty much the male that's at Maple Bay does call throughout the entire year because they're non-migratory. So that if they found a successful nest site, they're not gonna go anywhere. They're gonna hang tight to it and continue to defend it. Not with the same gusto as that single male in the breeding season, but certainly on a nightly basis for a short period of time. So that's wonderful. That's fantastic. And Salt Spring Island Conservancy, Ren and I, we would love to follow up with that. If you could email, that would be great.
Bridget would like to know, is there a screech sound after which they are called?
I know, right? Let's rename this bird. No, not, oh, okay. So if you think about the taxonomy, so you have the Eastern Screech-Owl and the Western Screech-Owl, and it's the screech aspect apparently is far more common in the Eastern Screech-Owl of doing a kind of screechy note. Maybe if there's people here from that know Eastern Screech-Owls who've heard it do a screech, that'd be interesting if someone can type that in comments. But for Western Screech-Owl, I mean, it should be Western, lovely, bouncing ball, owl call. Nothing screechy, really. What about you, Ren? Have you ever heard a screech?
I have never heard a screech-owl screeching. Now, one thing that's really interesting, I had a conversation with a birding buddy of mine, Peter McAllister, and he pointed out that on iBird Pro, they have a recording of a Western screech-owl, and they are giving a really bizarre call. And if you want, I'll play it for you right now.
Sure.
I have never heard this, and I even question if the ID is correct for this bird. So
Cool.
see if I can play it. Okay, I have never. Have you ever?
No.
No.
I've heard saw-whets. Saw-whets will make that kind of a sound.
Exactly.
That's what I think it is.
That's what I think it is too. Okay, that's my answer to that.
Mystery solved by Ren and Tania. Oh,
And that looks to be all the questions on vocalizations.
excellent. So over to you, Ren, to discuss monitoring plans for this first year of the 3-year program for Salt Spring Island Conservancy.
Okay, so as we've said, we've just started this program. This year we have both limited funding, but also limitations due to COVID regulations. So originally our plan was to pair volunteers with more experienced volunteers to go out on survey routes. But until we get better clearance for that with COVID-19, we are going to do it with people who are in their own bubbles, because it's quite difficult. These routes are driven, and a lot of our roads, our stations don't have the ability for 2 cars to stop. So safety first, and so limited in that area this year. Once we do surveys, and even prior to surveys, we will be doing outreach with landowners where we know we've had screech owls in the past, or we find screech owls on our surveys this year. So there'll be a lot of outreach going on, and then permission to talk to landowners, maybe visit their property if they're willing, and engage in finding out what's going on, if we have a pair nesting, or whether this is a good location to put up nest boxes. So nest box program will get rolling more in the fall when we start to put nest boxes up. So there could be some opportunity to be involved in the nest box aspect of things, but it's early days right now. So I think the best thing would be for people who are interested in this program to please email the Conservancy, and I will keep a list of everybody who's either interested because of the property that they own, or they might be interested in another aspect of being involved. We'll also be using the acoustic recorders to check sites and to monitor sites where we know we have nests. And we are already monitoring our existing nest boxes, and natural nests will come later in the year. So let's see, yeah, in the fall is when we will be doing much more of our nest box program. I'm glad that there's 3 years because COVID has kind of slowed things down, but we have 2 more years in which to involve people more. So I really look forward to hearing from people who are interested in learning more about the project. We'll be able to send you out some more information if you email. There'll be an email address at the end of this presentation. I think that's it.
Thank you, Ren. Oh, another slide for you.
All right, there you go. So the website address is here, and also an email if you're interested in the project as a landowner, as a volunteer, or if you're interested in becoming a member. Memberships support our work a lot. So any of those areas of interest, you can send an email to this info@saltspringconservancy.ca. Yeah, it's good.
Thank you. We'll have that email at the end as well.
Great.
So, like I said, involved with many people over many years. I just want to do a thank you for, because some of you might be on this meeting even, volunteers. Can't do it without all the people who help find the owls, who help make the boxes, allow permission to come survey their property, put up boxes on their property, just lots of volunteer efforts that has made these programs very, very successful. So the landowners and the habitat stewards. The hat owl leads, like I mentioned, Joanna Preston's been really helping big time with all the hat work, with her being physically in Victoria. It's just wonderful to have her helping on that project and helping to lead it. Also has a daughter close age of mine, so we can get together, look for the owls, and bring our kids along, which is really wonderful. They might not think so, but they come along. Funding through similar funding, Habitat Stewardship Program, private donations, in-kind support, MSc. So I was able to get some MSc funding for my co-op students that I try to hire every year. Last summer I wasn't. It was unfortunately due to COVID. Might not have co-op students this year, but the main project when I hire co-op students at Madrone is to assist on the owl project. It's a really good fit for sure. And the student funding, definitely. And then just further acknowledgements. Although this is Ren's slide, so I guess
yeah. Like the hat project, we are able to do our project with financial support from the Government of Canada through the HSP program, and also thanks to Habitat Acquisition Trust for their administrative support in our project, as we have this, I like to call it a sister project to HAT. And thanks a lot to Tania Tripp for doing a letter of support and for your ongoing direction for all things Screech-Owl, and for this presentation today, Tania. It's been just wonderful, and we really, really appreciate it here at the Conservancy.
Thank you. Happy to talk about owls in case anybody couldn't notice that. So with that, another opportunity for maybe 10 minutes of kind of other questions that maybe are now on your mind, having seen the whole presentation by Ren and I.
I'll just have a look through here. Many thank yous for a wonderful presentation. Oh, I've lost the chat here. Sorry. Here we go. There doesn't look to be any new questions here.
Well, maybe, hopefully we'll meet around the same time next year and we'll revisit what we've achieved in year one, and lots of time to think. And if you have any questions you think of tonight or over the next few weeks, just email to info@saltspringconservancy.ca.
There are a couple of questions, actually, that I see didn't get asked. If you want me to ask one.
Yeah, Ren, thank you.
What type of tree do they prefer? Would they choose dead cedar trees?
We keep looking for nests in arbutus and cedar. There have been records of them in the Campbell et al. 1990 series of Birds of BC. But Ren, I think we've only ever found them in fir, Douglas fir.
So far, that's true.
So far. But I mean, our sample size, I think, so we've, the science community came together with one of the lead government people for species at risk on the Lower Mainland, Kim Wellstead. She says, how come I only have like 19 records of nest sites? And we're all like, because that's what we have. So if we have more records, we might find them in a cedar. You would think a cedar, if it was the right size opening, I think that's the limitation. In the cedar trees, you usually have more of those feeding holes created by a pileated woodpecker. And so they're more oblong, they're larger. So they just might not go as deep or provide what they need. But if it was the perfect shape and size, you would think it would be really ideal.
I see another question. You okay if I ask them, Deborah? If the
Yes,
owl,
please.
if the owl's nocturnal, how do they prey on juncos?
Oh, so I think, Ren and I've talked about this a lot, Joanna and I too. It's like some birds, some of the songbirds actually even will make little vocalizations at night. In fact, some of the flycatchers, is it the Pacific Slope? Which is that one? Yeah, and they make these little chirps at night, and I'm sure some of their feathers that are in the screech owl boxes are those Pacific Slope flycatchers. And their hearing as an owl, as a predator, is very good. And I think if you have a roosting bird in a tree and they make that sound, I think that's all it would take. And also, so picture this, you're sitting here all day long, you're in your lovely forest, you're asleep, but you're still absorbing where everybody is, who's calling where. I think a predator could get a really good idea of like where there might be birds roosting, high, low, mid canopy. I mean, I think they're probably mapping that out and where they're going to search. Yeah, that's my thoughts on that. Or our thoughts, what we've had, like, how do they do that?
Or they may be aware of where some birds are nesting. Yeah, I know, it's amazing.
I know the ravens do that big time. They definitely map out their area, know where all those nests are. And the jays, all the corvids are very smart about that. And I don't know why an owl predator wouldn't also kind of have a good idea.
There's another one from David. With the spread of barred owls, are the screeches choosing different habitat, maybe younger second growth, where the bards have more difficulty predating on them?
So I feel, I don't have a scientific evidence paper to say it, but I feel that there has been a change in where the screech owls are occupying. They're just not in those riparian valley bottom sites like they used to be. Where Ren and I are finding them is on those mid drier slope sites in that second growth or older, mainly fir dominant forest with a lot of arbutus mixed amongst it. So they're more dry sites, and the old, like the data from prior to barred owl is screech owls are a riparian owl. They live along riparian corridors. And actually that holds true with the interior McFarlanei subspecies. They're still very tied to those riparian zones, but we don't see that as much, at least in the areas we've looked. So this thing, you don't want to generalize from like the few points that you have, even though we've found a number on the South Coast. You'd want to be able to check that. Is the North Coast the same way? I don't know. But a few other researchers have found some fascinating results in more bog type forest on northern Vancouver Island. And where was Jeremiah doing his research on the, was it Bella Bella and Bella Coola, Ren?
I forget. It was further north on the coast. Yeah.
Yeah. So he went out as a undergrad student doing some bioacoustic study for someone else and put all these recorders up and found all these like screech owls in this like hyper maritime. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the big bog blanket we have on northern Vancouver Island. If you go look in Google Earth, you'll see this really weird looking, very different than southern Vancouver Island. It's almost like an extension of some of this more what you would encounter as you go into the interior and some of the mainland. And so then the folks, the government folks at Ministry of Forest, Land and Natural Resource Operations found some funding to go look at the similar bog habitat on northern Vancouver Island to where Jeremiah had this success. In kind of ecosystem terms, we refer to it as a coastal western hemlock, very hyper maritime. So it's a CWHVH, and huge success on northern Vancouver Island. So now it's on my bucket list to get up there and find a nest in some stunted, I don't know what. What are they nesting in? So that was really exciting to hear this find, and that's why it's important that when you kind of make these, that I need to, as a professional biologist, be careful when I make generalizations, right? We want to always be careful where we apply that to and stick to kind of the reality of what we know based on how much we know. Great question.
If you have time for a couple more short ones, we could do it.
Sure.
Jacqueline's wondering if they nest in any type of fir tree or just Douglas fir. Yeah, she lives in a place that has Pacific silver fir at Lake Cowichan.
So that amabilis fir is also referred to as balsam, I think, is maybe what that's referring to. And I don't see why not. In fact, when you go into more inland of that CWH and you lose that Douglas fir component, you still have screech owls. So there's certainly nesting and hemlock, and amabilis fir quite often has a lot of those cavities as one of the first trees that the woodpeckers are creating those homes for them. So I would say I'm sure they could and do where they still exist.
Sounds like any tree that a woodpecker is going to make a nest in will be game for a screech owl, eh?
Yeah, I think so.
Last question, as a riparian species, which we know now that screeches are kind of all over the place, but do screeches eat frogs?
So yes, I don't see why not. I think that it's kind of hard for them to do frogs if they're, I think they might be nesting in that drier habitat, but they still might go down to the riparian to try to grab food and then hide away their habitat. I forget that website. Somebody posted like 9 things you never knew about Western screech owls. There was this website I stumbled across, and it had photos of screech owls catching fish. It had photos of screech owls eating roadkill. That was kind of
Wow.
interesting. And it had, yeah, it's just some weird, I mean, I think something I love about studying nature, it always shows me that you don't know what you're talking about, Tania. Like, here's something new. And the more you study and you realize all that variation in wildlife of what their patterns are and what they eat and what they use to survive. I mean, if you think about it from just a survival of these species being in existence for as long as they have, if they all had only one survival strategy, they might not still be in existence, right? So those kind of species that are able to have that flexibility, like just some screech owl decides, wow, these frogs are quite tasty. And then they're able to have like really this extra source of food. And another screech owl says, well, these, I don't, that little fish that's in that stream is catching my attention, realizes the value of eating that. So, you know, these individuals can help have that variability from a gene pool perspective that allows that flexibility of all this kind of variation to help the success of the species. I don't think I've said that fully in the right way you know, but essentially that's a simple way of how I see it, that variation of survival. And that's one real disadvantage the spotted owl has. Very narrow diet of what it prefers to eat, of what we know, like very, doesn't seem aggressive enough to really make the barred owls go away, can even interbreed with barred owls. So there's a lot of things that are putting those poor spotted owls at a real disadvantage for sure. But you know, anyway, so I think it's fascinating that I'm sure screech owls eat frogs. Not all of them, but some of them would. And some eat a lot of birds and some eat more mammals. So you could look in a nest box and see all this like mammal fur. And I think I saw a note about pellets. So yes, they leave pellets. I'm always picking them up and then I forget about them in my gear. So, but those pellets can be used for eDNA and all kinds of things to confirm that it was a screech owl the pellet was from, what was it eating. There's all kinds of things that can be done with pellets.
That seems to be about it for questions, unless we missed some. We may have. I apologize if we did.
No, that's great. Well, thank you, everybody. Very excited that Salt Spring is getting the opportunity to kind of dive into this further, and I'm just really happy and looking forward to seeing what everybody finds.
We are too, Tania. Thank you for launching us off and for all your great info.
Thank you, everybody.
On behalf of the Salt Spring Island Conservancy, a big thank you to Tania for your presentation today. That was wonderful and so informative. Thank you, Ren Ferguson, for helping out as well.
Yeah.
And I'll be leaving the chat now and exiting the meeting. So if you have any more questions, please send them to info@saltspringconservancy.com. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, friends.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Oh, I'm sure I was there.